Trench-12 was not supposed to be about a hole in the ground. At least, that is how the file tries to frame it. On the cover, in the stiff language of its translated summary, it is described as a transient geomorphological depression observed under controlled monitoring. Only in the code name does the real premise leak through. The USSR watched a pit appear and erase itself, over and over, until the people left in charge stopped being sure which parts of the landscape had ever been solid. That is why this folder exists, and why it feels wrong in the hands. It is thinner than some of the thick, boastful projects that others still quote at conferences. But the paper inside has the particular look of sheets that have been retyped, re-signed, and put back where they can be found without ever really being explained. The spine label is plain. Anomaly Trench-12, Seismic Sector P4. Someone later added, in pencil, a quieter line across the inside of the cover, squeezed against the cardboard edge. Ground does not agree with the map. That is not a line you write after a simple landslide. The place they called Sector P4 was never meant to be romantic. In the photographs, it is almost aggressively unremarkable. Low hills, scrub, a thin line of birch trees along a dry streambed. The horizon cut by a distant ridge that looks like every other ridge in that part of the world. The ground there is not dramatic. It is layered in the indifferent way of old river terraces. Loam, sand, gravel, clay, a few shallow rock shelves. It was chosen, originally, not for what it did, but for what it did not do. It did not flood often. It did not collapse easily. It did not attract tourists. On one of those hills sat a small seismic station. Concrete bunker, half buried in the slope. A stubby antenna poking up like a broken tooth. A metal door painted in a shade of green that never seems to exist in nature. The station had started its life listening to underground tests in another era. When those grew less frequent, it was repurposed to monitor industrial activity and natural microseismic events. In practice, that meant it listened to a lot of trucks, a few small earthquakes, and the endless, soft grinding of soil settling under its own weight. The anomaly that would become Trench-12 began, according to the earliest surviving logs, as a nuisance. One spring, the station's instruments recorded a series of shallow tremors along a line that did not match any known fault. The events were small, too weak to be felt by anyone walking on the surface, but persistent enough to stand out from the usual background. They came at irregular intervals, always from the same approximate direction, always with a curious lack of accompanying noise. No rock fracturing, no distant rumbles, just a subtle, repeated change in how the seismic waves moved through a particular patch of ground. The technicians at P4 did what they were trained to do. They logged, they plotted, they called a regional geologist. He visited, stared at their printouts, then walked the direction indicated by the traces, boots crunching through dead grass, eyes scanning the gently rolling land for any sign that something was about to give way. He found nothing. No cracks, no slumps, no fresh scar on the hillside. The streambed was dry, its banks intact. A few old trenches, relics of forgotten exercises from an earlier decade, had softened into shallow depressions filled with weeds. None of them lined up cleanly with the seismic readings. In his report, the geologist wrote that the anomalies were likely due to minor subsurface compaction or man-made activity beyond the mapped zone. It was a polite way of saying, your instruments are more nervous than they need to be. The station staff accepted this. partly because they wanted to, partly because they had other duties. The tremors continued, tolerated as quirks of a system that had been bolted together, upgraded, and patched for years. On the chart rolls, the traces from that direction developed a familiar look, a particular rise and fall that the night shift could recognize at a glance. They called it the soft knock. Trench-12 makes its first true appearance in the file on a day the logs describe in bland terms as field verification. A small team, 2 technicians from the station, 1 representative from the regional seismic office, 1 KGB liaison whose presence is explained only by the phrase sector-sensitive location, drove out along the dirt track that threaded between the hills. They brought with them a portable seismograph, a set of metal pins, a tape measure, and the quiet sense that this would be a formality. They parked where the reading suggested the soft knock originated, a gently sloping field on the shoulder of a low hill, covered in thin grass and scattered stones. The technicians drove the pins into the ground in a rough grid, unrolled their cables, connected the portable unit, and listened. For an hour, nothing unusual happened. Wind hissed in the equipment. Distant trucks on some far-off road made the usual low murmur. The Earth's own restless shiver painted fine, jittery lines across the paper. Then, very slowly, the ground in the middle of their grid began to sink. The file is careful here. It does not reach for drama. It calls it progressive subsidence over limited area. But the descriptions in the attached statements are more vivid. One technician noticed that his pins, which had been standing upright, were now leaning slightly inward, as if the soil beneath them were being drawn towards a center that did not yet exist. The KGB liaison felt a faint shift under his boots, like standing on a mattress someone else has just sat down on. Over the next 15 minutes, a shallow depression formed, a wide, gentle bowl, a few tens of centimeters deep, centered on a spot that, on their map, would later be marked as point 12 in their grid. There was no cracking, no collapsing edge. The grass rode the curve downwards as if glued to the soil. Stones did not roll in. They slid with the lowering surface, maintaining their spacing, as if the whole patch of ground were a rigid skin being pushed from below. Then, with a soft, almost indifferent motion, the bowl deepened into a trench. The technicians watched, at first with professional interest, then with a quiet, tightening unease, as the depression's edges sharpened. What had been a subtle, basin-like sag became, over the course of another 10 minutes, a clearly defined pit, 3 to 4 meters deep, roughly 12 meters long, its floor smooth and oddly clean. The grass at its edges hung over for a moment, then broke and slumped in thin, even curtains, as though reluctant to obey gravity. No one claimed to see the soil flow. There was no dust cloud, no rushing of earth. On the seismic printout, the event showed up not as the jagged spike of a collapse, but as a thickening of the familiar soft knock signature. A slow, heavy pulse. When it stopped, they were left with a trench that had not existed half an hour earlier. There's a photograph taken from the lip looking down. It is grainy and badly exposed, but certain details still come through. The sidewalls are near vertical, marked with horizontal stripes of soil and sediment that match the surrounding hillside. There are no obvious breaks, no mixed layers, no evidence of recent disturbance. It is as if the hill had always contained that cross-section and had simply decided to show it. The geologist, when he received the pictures in the report, did not accept them at face value. He drove out, climbed down a rope into the trench, ran his hand along the walls, and looked for the usual signs of erosion, scouring, or faulting. He found none. His summary, translated, is cautious. Observed trench exhibits stratigraphy consistent with undisturbed hillside, yet absence of overlying material unaccounted for by known mechanisms. No evidence of mass transport downslope. Event does not match standard landslide, sinkhole, or subsidence profiles. The KGB liaison's attached comment is shorter. If this is a hoax, it is elaborate. If not, it is beyond authorized models. They marked the trench as Anomaly 12 because it sat on the 12th stake of their grid. Over time, the file would come to use the codename Trench-12 interchangeably for the feature and the story. They fenced it off. They installed more instruments, additional seismographs, ground tilt meters, simple mechanical indicators like plumb lines and rods driven into the soil. They sent a request up the chain for further guidance. While they waited for an answer, the trench waited with them. Harmless and absurd. The answer they received, weeks later, did not arrive in the form of a theory. It came as an instruction. Continue monitoring, record all changes, do not publicize. That last part, in those days, was almost redundant. There is a brief lull in the file. Trench-12 sits on the hillside, rain darkening its walls, snow half filling it in winter, thaw and wind reshaping its edges slightly. Local wildlife finds it inconvenient. A fox falls in, climbs out using a fallen branch. A stray dog refuses to approach the fence. The ground around it settles by a few millimeters, then stabilizes. The anomaly could have ended there. A one-time oddity, a geological curiosity in a remote sector. They might have chalked it up to an unknown local process and buried the story in a technical journal no one read. It did not end there because, one night, the trench closed. The event is logged in two kinds of handwriting. In the neat, controlled script of the official record, it is described as spontaneous partial infill with accompanying subsurface adjustment. In the jagged lines of a technician's personal notebook, it is explained more plainly. We came back after the night shift change, and the pit was gone. The hill looked as if someone had smoothed it with the back of a giant hand. The instruments had captured the process while the humans were busy elsewhere. Shortly after 2 a.m, the seismographs recorded a slow, rising tremor, similar in some respects to the one that had preceded the trench's formation, but with reversed phase. Tilt meters around the site logged a gentle upward motion at their inner ends, as if the ground was pushing up from the center. The mechanical rods sank a few centimeters, then rose. There was no sudden jump, no sharp fracture. The motion lasted nearly 20 minutes. When the dawn shift walked out to check, they found the fence standing, the posts askew where the earth had moved, and within the marked perimeter a slightly raised patch of ground where the trench had been. Grass bent but not torn, soil damp, no visible scar. The rope they had left anchored to the old lip now lay slack on the surface, half buried by the gentle upheaval. They dug a small, exploratory pit at the center, more out of stubbornness than hope. The soil layers looked undisturbed. No cavity, no mixed rubble. Just the same sequence of loam, sand, and clay they saw on every textbook cross-section for that area. The geologist, summoned once more, stared at the patch, then at his earlier reports. He wrote, this time, only one line. Anomaly persists in absence of visible structure. From that day, Trench-12 stopped being a static feature and became an event. Over the next year, the ground at Point 12 went through at least 4 more cycles. Sometimes the trench would form over the course of an hour, remain open for days, then rise and erase itself in a night. Sometimes it would open faster, as if impatient, and close almost immediately, leaving the hillside looking as though nothing had happened. On one occasion, it only partially reclosed, leaving a shallow depression that fooled nobody. The patterns were irregular. They did not match weather, seasons, or known seismic triggers. Smaller tremors elsewhere in the region came and went without stirring Trench-12. Conversely, several of its appearances were not accompanied by any detectable quakes beyond its own strange signature. The station staff tried to predict it. They logged barometric pressure, groundwater levels, distant explosions, even the train schedules on the nearest line, searching for a correlation. None held. The only constant was that when the trench appeared, it did so with the same clean exposure of stratigraphy and the same refusal to behave like a normal hole. The file grows more crowded in this period. Sketches of the trench from different cycles, tables of timing, attempts at naming what is happening in language that does not make anyone look unscientific. One phrase recurs: negative volume. The lead seismologist at P4 starts using it in his internal memos. The ground at Point 12 appears to enter a state of negative volume relative to its surroundings, he writes. Material that should occupy that space is, for some period, unaccounted for. Yet no corresponding mound or collapse is observed nearby. He does not write vanished, he writes unaccounted for. The KGB observers following the case are more blunt in their private comments. One simply notes, "We are watching a pit appear from nothing and then pretend it was never there." Another asks, in the margin of a report, if this is a test, who is the tester? That question never receives an official answer, but it changes how the anomaly is handled. Additional resources arrive. Not many. This was still just a pit in a remote sector, not a reactor or a missile, but enough to signal increased interest. A portable lab is set up near the station. More sensitive equipment is delivered. A small, tight-lipped team from a central institute visits to install their own instruments and then leaves, taking some of their data with them. The local staff are told to continue business as usual, but they are no longer alone in their curiosity. One of the new devices is a dense array of geophones and accelerometers arranged in a spiral around Point 12. The idea is to capture fine-grained detail not just of when the trench opens or closes, but of how the ground around it responds. The team also drives several narrow boreholes in a ring, inserting simple probes to measure moisture, soil pressure, and micro-movements at depth. Their first major experiment is, in essence, patient waiting. They let the array listen through an entire cycle. When the pit begins to form, the spiral geophones record something the earlier, coarser network had missed. The disturbance does not radiate outward evenly from the center. Instead, subtle shifts propagate along narrow paths in the subsurface, veins of altered behavior that snake through the soil and rock before converging at Point 12. The pattern, when plotted in plan view, resembles an irregular root system feeding into a single central stem. The borehole probes, meanwhile, report temporary reductions in pressure at certain depths, as if the ground is becoming lighter without losing density. Moisture readings fluctuate in ways that suggest water is redistributing itself along those same unseen channels. None of this looks like ordinary subsidence. It looks like a decision. That word is mine, not theirs. They remain careful. The seismologist writes, "The anomaly appears to recruit a specific network of subsurface pathways when manifesting, rather than acting equally on all material in the affected radius." He leaves the rest unsaid. They try simple interventions. During a later cycle, when the trench is open and stable, they suspend a marked metal frame across its mouth and then allow it to hang inside, measuring any forces as the ground moves. They lower instruments into the empty space to record micro variations in air pressure, humidity, and stray fields. They leave a bag of inert tracer particles on the floor, small, dense spheres designed to be easily detected if moved or disturbed. When the trench begins to close, the frame registers an upward force, as if the ground is rising beneath it before contact. The tracers, when they dig in the reconstituted soil weeks later, are not found in any concentration. They appear only as rare, scattered specks, mixed evenly through a volume that should not have been disturbed enough to accept them. The report on this experiment concludes, with some reluctance. Events at point 12 cannot be described solely as vertical displacement. The material within the affected region appears to undergo a reconfiguration inconsistent with standard conservation expectations at the observed scales. Again, they avoid certain words: teleportation, removal, replacement. Those remain unprinted. From the security side, the question shifts from "what is this?" to "can this be made to happen elsewhere?" And more quietly, "can this be made to stop happening here?" If the ground can be persuaded to unmake and remake itself in one patch of anonymous hillside, what is to prevent similar behavior under something more important? A railway, a dam, a city. Trench-12 is a curiosity as long as it stays where it is. It becomes a potential threat as soon as you consider that it might not. The file contains traces of attempts to influence the anomaly. None are described in detail. We see them only through procurement lists and half-redacted notes, orders for controlled vibration sources, for arrays of heavy weights to be moved in patterns around the site, for low-frequency sound generators. The idea seems to have been to see whether external rhythms, pulses in the ground, in the air, in the structures, could shift the timing or placement of the pit's appearances. If they achieved anything, it was not the kind of success anyone wanted to claim. In one series of tests, they drove a periodic signal into the ground from a line of mechanical vibrators placed along the hillside. The signal was chosen to mimic, in slowed form, the characteristic soft knock that had preceded earlier cycles. For several days, nothing unusual happened. On the 5th, the trench did appear, but not exactly at point 12. It opened a few meters downslope, partially overlapping the fence line. The new pit cut through one of the boreholes, leaving the probe hanging in midair for an hour before the ground below it caught up. The instruments recorded chaotic motion in the subsurface, as the anomaly's usual shallow pathways were forced to intersect with the artificially excited zone. After the trench erased itself, the hillside did not return to its previous state. A small, permanent kink remained in the slope where soil had settled out of alignment. Water pooled there after rains, and the vegetation pattern changed. The experiment was not repeated. The risk that their attempts to steer the anomaly might simply smear it into a larger, less predictable mess was deemed unacceptable, even by those who had pushed for a more active approach. Meanwhile, the KGB unit assigned to the sector continued its quieter work, watching the watchers. Their internal notes, what little survives, show a progression familiar in this archive. At first, they treat the anomaly as potentially useful, a phenomenon that might be harnessed for denial of access, destruction of buried infrastructure, perhaps even the controlled disposal of sensitive material. As the file grows and the behavior remains stubbornly disobedient, their interest shifts towards containment and obscurity. One comment, written in a narrow margin beside an early proposal to test the anomaly under an artificial structure, reads, "We cannot yet ensure that it will select only what we want removed. Until then, keep it away from anything we are not willing to lose." Another, later, is more pessimistic. Assumption that we control anything here is administrative convenience only. The culmination of the story, at least in the way the file tells it, comes not with a spectacular final event, but with a subtle one. The strange shift that passes through the log entries themselves. By the time this happens, Trench-12 has been cycling for several years. The visits from central institutes have become less frequent. The world outside the sector has changed focus. Underground tests in other regions leave their scars. Political winds shift. Priorities move on. The anomaly is still there, still erratic, but no longer fashionable. The station at P4 is told, unofficially, to keep an eye on it without expecting new equipment or attention. The KGB unit remains, partly because hierarchies move slowly, partly because nobody wants to be the one who signs off on leaving a self-erasing pit unwatched. Then, during a particularly long closed phase, months without the trench appearing, the file shows signs of a different kind of instability. It starts with a discrepancy in dates. A technician reviewing older chart rolls notices that the timestamps on a series of recordings from a previous cycle no longer match the entries in the station logbook. The logs say the trench appeared on the 14th and closed on the 16th. The printed dates on the chart paper now read 13th to 15th. The shift is small, one day, but consistent across all the sheets for that event. He assumes a labeling error. Paper swapped between boxes, misfiled rolls, something mundane. He goes to the cupboard where the blank chart rolls are stored, pulls out a fresh one, and checks its pre-printed date markers. They are correct and current. No offset. No sign that the manufacturer has changed the printing. He returns to older events and finds similar discrepancies, but not in any neat pattern. Some cycles now appear to have lasted one day less than the logs describe. Others seem stretched by a few hours. In a few cases, the dates match perfectly, as if nothing has changed. The logbook itself, written in ink, shows no sign of alteration. It is as if time inside the archive has been nudged in small increments in specific places, leaving human handwriting as a reference frame, and printed numbers as sliding objects. The station chief, a cautious man, refrains from describing it that way. In his report, he writes only, "There are inconsistencies between recorded instrument timestamps and manual logs in several historical events. Cause unknown, no evidence of tampering." He suggests recalibrating the station clocks and reviewing storage procedures. He does not mention Trench-12 in that context. The KGB liaison, on the other hand, writes a private note for his superiors that links the issues explicitly. Pattern of date and time anomalies appears predominantly in segments associated with Anomaly 12, he observes. It is possible that our record of the event is less stable than the event itself. less stable record. That is the kind of phrase that keeps archivists awake for reasons very different from mine. More signs follow. Marginal notes in pencil that staff remember writing in certain reports are no longer there, replaced by other comments in their own handwriting that they do not recall making. Map pins marking past trench appearances on the sector wall chart are found slightly shifted, their holes in the cork not matching the lines drawn around them. Copies of the same report file held in different offices show minute differences in wording, as if they were additions separated by more than one round of revision, but only one round is recorded. None of this, on its own, proves anything. Human memory is flawed, paper warps, pins slip, but it all clusters around one subject. No one reports similar instabilities in records about other local matters. Well repairs, minor quakes, weather. In a meeting whose basic notes survive but whose atmosphere can only be guessed, the station chief, the seismologist, and the KGB liaison discuss what to do. The transcript, stripped of names, is dry. One suggests treating the discrepancies as archival drift and correcting them by fiat, rewriting, retyping, making the documents line up by hand. Another warns that without understanding the cause, they might simply be erasing evidence of the anomaly's influence. The liaison, caught between his duty to maintain order and his awareness that some orders are paper thin, proposes a compromise. We record both versions. We keep the discrepancies in a file that does not circulate. That file is the one I am holding now, or rather, holding a copy of. The original, judging by a note at the back, was boxed separately and moved to a deeper archive. This is where the strange shift in the final log entries comes in. On a particular day, its exact date is appropriately one of the disputed ones, the station's instruments record a brief, intense, soft knock signature from the direction of point 12. The amplitude is lower than in earlier trench-forming events, but the pattern is right. The staff on duty go outside. The ground at point 12 is unremarkable. No trench, no sagging, no new kink. The hillside looks as it has looked for months. They return to the logs and write a bland entry. Anomaly-like signal with no visible surface manifestation. They mark it as a possible precursor. They resolve to watch closely in the following days. Nothing happens in the ground. Something happens in the files. Within a week, several of the double reports they had set aside for the discrepancy study, documents where two versions of events had coexisted, are found to be single again. Where there had been two different date sets, there is now one, neat and internally consistent. The odd phrasing differences between copies have vanished. It is as if someone had gone through and standardized the language. No one admits to doing this. The people who had access deny it convincingly. The typewriter used for the original documents has not been touched in that interval. The carbon copies show no signs of retyping. The KGB unit, whose job it is to suspect tampering even when it is inconvenient, find themselves in the position of wondering whether their own suspicion has been overwritten. The liaison writes in a short, restricted note, "After last anomaly signal, divergence between document versions reduced without traceable human intervention. Likely causes, forgery, prank, error, not supported by available evidence. Files now align more closely with central narrative of trivial geological anomaly." He underlines the last phrase. Align more closely. From this point, the official record of Trench-12 becomes almost aggressively boring. Reports stress the lack of surface changes. The anomaly is described as diminishing. The seismograph's occasional soft knocks are attributed to local heterogeneities or distant quarry blasts. Funding is cut. The central institutes stop sending people. The recommendation is made to reclassify Point 12 as resolved. It has the feel of a story deciding to end itself before someone else ends it less gracefully. Off to one side, in a smaller handwriting, the liaison adds the sentence that keeps this file from being entirely anesthetized. Sector personnel have begun referring to Point 12 as the place that removed its own evidence. This is not an attitude we should encourage. Shortly after, the decision is made to close the station at P4 altogether. On the surface, the reasons are mundane: cost, redundancy with other facilities, shifting strategic needs. In the internal correspondence, a different logic leaks through. One memo notes, continued operation in presence of unresolved archival anomalies may encourage undesirable speculation. Another suggests that transferring the staff will allow any local narrative distortions to dissipate. The station is decommissioned. Instruments are packed, shipped, repurposed. The bunker is sealed. The sector becomes once again a stretch of unremarkable hills, with one fenced patch of ground overgrown with grass and shrubs, where, if you know where to look, the soil has a slightly different color. Trench-12, as an object of study, is officially over. Of course, people who lived with an anomaly do not close as neatly as the files that describe it. Years later, when careers had scattered and uniforms changed color, fragments of their private recollections made their way into quieter channels. Letters, informal interviews, the sort of off-record conversations that only end up transcribed when someone like me comes along and insists on treating them as data. One former technician, by then working in a civilian observatory, described a recurring dream he had for several winters after leaving P4. In the dream, he would walk across an ordinary field near his new workplace, following a familiar path, until he realized that his boots were making no sound. The grass bent but did not rustle. His steps had weight but no echo. Only when he stopped and looked down did he see that the ground where he stood was slightly too smooth, as if some detail had been erased. He would wake with the clear sense that he had just stepped off the lip of something that did not yet know it was missing. In another recollection, a clerk who had handled the sector's paperwork for years admitted that somewhere along the way she had lost track of how many times she had rewritten the summary of Anomaly 12. "I know I retyped that page more than once," she said, "because I remember being annoyed at the phrasing. But when I looked later, there was only one copy, and it was phrased exactly the way the supervisor liked it. I could not find my earlier version even in the waste bin. Maybe I imagined doing it twice. Maybe the paper just chose. None of this would hold up in court or in a physics seminar. It barely holds up in translation. But it lingers in the margins of the archive, like faint finger marks on a sheet that someone has tried to wipe clean. The last pages of the file are a mix of loose ends and attempts to tie them. A short note from a Central Geophysical Institute concludes, with weary professionalism, that Anomaly 12 likely reflects rare, but not impossible, subsurface processes in unconsolidated sediments. No evidence of broader regional risk. A security summary insists that no operationally exploitable mechanism was identified, and recommends that all related material be held under restricted access to limit distraction. Below these, on the inside of the back cover, the same pencil hand that wrote, "Ground does not agree with the map," at the beginning has left one more line, almost obscured by a smudge. We watch the earth open and close as if editing itself. The paper tried to keep up. The paper lost. There is no date beside that sentence. Sitting here, decades later, in a different building with different instruments humming behind the walls, I find the most unsettling part of Trench-12 is not the pit itself. It is the way the anomaly seemed to reach sideways into the systems used to describe it, shaving edges off dates, smoothing out differences, nudging text towards a narrower story. An ordinary landslide leaves scars you can point to on a hillside and in an archive. This file suggests that some events, whatever they are, do the opposite. They erase, clean, and tidy, not just in soil, but in memory. They leave behind not spectacular destruction, but an absence that looks reasonable on first glance. It would be comforting to treat that as a quirk of one specific case in one forgotten sector. A bureaucratic glitch around a local curiosity. But I have read enough of these folders now to see echoes. City Zero, the town that kept behaving in its own statistics after its residents were gone. Wormwood 2, the fallout that refused to follow the distance rules and instead taught the monitoring network a new way to twitch. Project Rift, where a field built to move a hall ended up nudging the way people walked through their own rooms. And here, Trench-12, a hole that opened and closed without displacing a gram of soil where anyone could find it. That seemed, at least once, to send a faint aftershock through the records kept about it until those records began to agree more with what the wider system wanted to believe. If you are looking for a moral, there is one, but it is a quiet, uncomfortable thing. We build maps of ground, of radiation, of resonance, of time, and we trust them. We know they are simplifications, but we expect them to fail in familiar ways. Mudslides, broken cables, misprinted dates. We do not expect the landscape, literal or otherwise, to push back and edit the map itself. Trench-12 is filed as a transient geomorphological depression. That is the phrase someone settled on, after arguments I can only imagine. Somewhere under that label lies a series of days when the people at P4 stood at the edge of a pit that had no business being there, watched it erase itself without leaving rubble, and then gradually came to feel their own memories and papers flex around the subject. The USSR watched a pit appear and erase itself. The KGB acknowledged the anomaly in a brief, restricted note, and then helped frame it as trivial. The hillside grew grass. The next time I misremembered the date of an event I was sure I had written down correctly, or find that 2 copies of a document do not quite match the way I thought they did, I will almost certainly blame myself. That is the sane thing to do. People are fallible. Archives are messy. There's no need to invoke self-editing ground. Still, a small, skeptical part of me, the part that has spent too long with these folders, will remember the line, "Ground does not agree with the map," and it will ask, very quietly, whether somewhere, in some sector no longer on any current chart, the Earth is still opening and closing at point 12. Indifferent to the fact that on paper it has been resolved. We would not know, not because no one is watching, but because whatever is being watched has already shown that it can lean over the observer's shoulder and suggest a different story. And people, especially in rooms full of instruments and directives, are very good at choosing the version that makes the fewest waves. Even if, somewhere under their boots, something is still moving in slow, careful ways. taking its own measurements of what should and should not exist.